Here's a simple memory map you can run with any winery or by the glass feature. So we start off with then. Name one historical practice that defined identity, say extended lees aging in large neutral wood to protect delicacy. Then we look at the now. So we name the modern analog that chases the same value, perhaps larger formats, ceramic, or careful inert gas management to keep texture without over oak. And then we have the because, where we name the enduring value, purity, longevity, a signature mouthfeel. When you present tradition as values over vessels, guests understand how places stay themselves while tools evolve.
Welcome to a special series on the Italian Wine Podcast. In this series, Italian wine ambassador Ryan Robinson reads and reflects on the art of wine storytelling, the latest book by renowned scholar Professor Attilio Scienza. From the myths of ancient Greece to the language of modern wine communication, the book explores how storytelling shapes our understanding of wine, and why these stories matter more now than ever. Let's begin the journey.
Have you ever tasted wet slate in a Mosel Riesling or gunflint in Chablis and wondered how a liquid can taste like stone? Today we'll go beyond the buzzwords. We'll explore why your brain can hear acidity, how stories really do change flavor, and why tradition is memory with an editor. This is episode 5 of Art of Wine Storytelling, Minerality, Myth, and Memory. I'm Ryan Robinson, and this series translates Attilio Scienza's Art of Wine Storytelling into tools you can use in tastings, trainings, and even more important, into sales. In chapters 13 through 15, Scienza connects 3 slippery ideas: synesthesia and the minerality of wine, the magic and responsibility of myth, and the ways tradition reconstructs memory over time. Here's the promise. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to define minerality without hand-waving, use myth to make meaning without distorting reality, and frame tradition as a living practice that preserves values even as methods change. Let's start with the sense puzzle that launched 1,000 tasting notes. Synesthesia and the minerality of wine, a taste of the past. The term minerality, a sensory descriptor increasingly used in the Anglo-Saxon press, associates this characteristics with high quality, originality, and authenticity, especially for white wines produced in northern regions. A sort of sense of place that evokes the relationship between the chemical composition of the soil and the wine. For some, it is a distinctive feature of some French wines such as Sancerre, Loire, or Chablis. It is linked to certain grape varieties such as Chardonnay, Sauvignon, or Chenin Blanc. The Italian wines that best identify with this characteristic are Timoroso, Lugana, Greco di Tufo, Caricante dell'Etna, and some aged Verdicchios. It is not easy to describe the sensory sensation it arouses, as it has a multisensory and multimodal origin that combines smell, taste, and trigeminal reactions. A saline minerality is distinguished from a bitter minerality. It is described as aromatic notes of flint, dry stone, musk, graphite, fresh oysters, smoky, and kerosene or petroleum in aged wines. The research remains highly skeptical about the fanciful hypothesis of a relationship between minerals present in the soil and the characteristics of the wine, and instead attributes these sensory notes to some sulfur compounds, thiols, present in reduced form, linked to the grape variety and the ripening conditions of the grapes. In fact, benzene metaethyl gives this empyreumatic dimension to a wine very similar to the note of flint. Taste sensations are the result of heterosensory stimuli located in different parts of the mouth that transform chemical messages into electrical messages. Acidity receptors ion channels, and membrane receptors. All taste cells have receptors of these three categories that interact with each other. So it is therefore illusory to think that there are specific areas of the mouth for mineral flavor. The taste senses are neither analytical nor synthetic, only discriminatory, and can make the difference. For example, between tartaric acid that evokes hardness and succinic acid that gives a salty or bitter sensation. Why then is the attribute minerality so effective in communication? Perhaps because it recalls an almost physical relationship with a place. It satisfies that search for origins, the nostalgia for youthful memories, for holidays in the countryside. This accompanies that mutation of taste that rejects concentrated, woody wines produced in a consumerist economic context with aggressive marketing strategies and turns instead to more balanced products, coming from more natural terroirs that are able to reveal this minerality by virtue of a more eco-sustainable viticulture. The perception of minerality, then, beyond a certain balance between flavor and aromatic notes, is not the imperfect reflection of a soil, but a mental representation that designates with a noun a strong evocative power. The minerality of a wine can become a synesthetic stimulus because it brings to mind the naturalness of the place and the memory of childhood. The magic of the story, the relevance of the myth. In the Italian wine-growing landscape, it is still possible to encounter the reality of the myth. That's where the Kleothian primordial duality comes in. Chthon means earth in Greek, a term found in the word alphoctonous, which means native to that land. In Greek mythology, Phocteon deities Gaia, Hades, and Demeter are distinguished from primordial deities, creators of the earth, such as Uranus, Zeus, and Athena. What is their relationship with wine in the landscape? There is no doubt that a red wine with structure produced in a harsh landscape like Valtellina or sunny Calabria is the Chthonian, a product of the earth, with deep roots preserved in the earth, in the depths of the cellar, in an amphora made of terracotta. The ancient Greeks poured the first drops of wine on the ground in a ritual of the libation of the symposium, to appease the Chthonian deities. A sparkling wine such as Prosecco, for example, produced on gentle hills with romantic connotations of Aldebaran, as a primordial characteristic, does not age in the cellar, is exposed to light with its clear bottles, is the wine of open-air parties, testifies to the beauty of the landscape, and is certainly more suitable for modern socio-cultural practices. There is also another duality, the Dionysian Apollyon. Dionysus is the god of wine, of excess, who drinks pure wine, for this reason called Acrophorus, as he does not pour the wine into the crater for dilution with water, as was the symposium custom. He identifies the wine as fleshy, strong, alcoholic, structured, and once again, the protagonist is the wild landscape, with wooded and rocky connotations. On the other hand, we have the wine of temperance, of spiritual elevation, of the Greek banquet, which was not drunken gathering, but a moment of discussion, narration, song. Who then is the character who must be invoked? Without any doubt, Apollo, Phoebus, the dispenser of light, who represents the pleasure of drinking as a moment for the spirit, not only for the flesh or for intoxication. Tradition and the reconstruction of memory. It is not the genus loci, the spirit of a place, that animates a wine-growing territory, but the genus sauculi, the spirit of the time, which allows us to narrate and think. The landscape is then a constructed space, where the spirit of a place is not only to be found in the contemplative symbolism of the founding fathers and in the divinities that protect them, but must also be evaluated with the eye of positivism, where the work of the homo faber, the working man, admirably integrates the natural attributes of a place. Neuromarketing, which is based on the development of cognitive sciences, uses storytelling to activate a process of synesthesia, through which a visual stimulus, the landscape and its landmarks, or a cultural evocation is associated with the sensory perception of the wine and the desire to reiterate the taste experience, providing the stimulus to think. When we go in search of the meaning of the myth, to grasp its essence or its truth, what matters first and foremost is the collective memory with which a social group reconstructs its past by adapting it to the cultural context of the present, from which it can then shape the future. The example of the tabula putinera, which sets out the roadwork of the Roman Empire, allows us to correspond the places identified on the map with the wines and the vines of the past. In the meaning of myth, the paradigm of epic events is narrated as fabula, tradition that must be used regardless of whether these wines were to be considered ancient or recent, original or reconstructed. The important thing is that the mythical tale is presented as a relic of tradition, but above all, it is considered significant for the community to which it refers. In the relationship between places and myth, the question above all, topographical. Places are still full of signs that in a fabulous past find their names. The tool to the document their origin is an indisposable intertwining. The fabula place becomes a fairy tale, and a form of dialogue is established between place and story, where it is the wine that takes meaning from the ancient fabulae, which finds its foundation in the places where wild vines were domesticated and where their grapes were vinified for the first time. The myth is therefore wine. The topos, or the theme, of the Trojan origins of Latin civilization through the protagonist of the Homeric and Virgilian nostoi, is not limited to the myth of the foundation of Rome and Naples, but the paradigmatic myth of Renaissance culture that identifies Greek heroes as the founders of many Italian cities. Often, the socialization of a place, of a city, according to structural anthropology, by connecting myth and language, is achieved through an object of recognition, a mountain shaped into a tower, a bridge crossing water, with the meaning of connecting, of uniting. What was the tool to read in that place of meaning offered by the natural world? And what is the basis of the project of transformation that progresses from nature towards culture, from the savage state to a civilized one? Wine, as a result of the domestication of the wild vine, becomes a sort of milestone that marks time and renews memory. In Italy, wine-growing communities form an original culture in the agricultural world. Although strongly anchored in reality, winemakers have the ability to perpetually reinvent their past through an emblematic and centuries-old product. Compared to the standardization of most sectors of contemporary society, winemakers occupy a cultural space halfway between rural and urban, tradition and innovation. In the relationship between the agricultural communities of Italy and the territory, the vineyard represents the structuring element, a sort of ritual center, full of economic, political, and symbolic significance, according to the French historian Ferdinand Bratto. For anthropologists, earthly ritual centers have a material consistency, a wooden or stone artifact, a place full of symbolic meanings such as the vineyard, and constitute a real anchoring function on the territory, representing a center of social aggregation with transcendental contents. Isn't the mosaic of the Italian viticulture very different from this analysis? Each a sort of ridge between different populations and languages, which carries with it the deepest, albeit less visible, signs of a defense of the small homeland, and its interdependence, sometimes conflictual towards neighboring communities. Landscape, therefore understood as a monument, a place of the spirit, from momentum, a Latin word that encompasses the Indo-European root min, from which men's intelligence, reason, and memony, remember, think, reflect. Looking at a geological map of Italy, the seemingly chaotic distribution of colors is striking, like some kind of complex mosaic. It depicts the families of geological matrices, the stratigraphic units, the types of rocks, and testifies to the great and varied richness of the soils that gave rise to it. Italy accounts for about 50% of the world's soil diversity. But that's not all. Italy is also the richest in viticultural biodiversity, with about 2,300 vines, of which 644 are registered in the National Register of Varieties and therefore approved for cultivation. If we cross-reference these data, we obtain a kaleidoscope of interactions of territories and varieties, which make Italy a repository of wine and cultural experiences that has no equal in the world. The study of viticultural landscapes, due to their strong character identity and their implications related to the quality of wine, is less and less oriented towards deterministic and economic aspects and more linked to cultural context and social organization. Furthermore, since a landscape is a relationship between an observed spatial subject and an observing human subject, an unbearable interference is created from the point of view of the Cartesian analytical approach, which inspires our entire scientific method, since landscape science is to be understood as a science of complexity that must take into account different spheres of knowledge, human and material sciences, affectivity and rationality, physics of space, and metaphysics of aesthetics. In the collective imagination, aesthetic aspects and sensory characteristics often appear irreconcilable. What they do have in common: historically, art and science have always been intertwined. Think of the Renaissance. Then their paths separated. Why does art now matter less? Why has science become less accessible? The difficulty lies in making the so-called two cultures interact in a context in which more attention is paid to humanistic than to scientific culture, despite the fact that ours is a technological world. Things are not miracles. Fire was not created by Prometheus. Science advances through the hard work of theory and practice, but culture is still a myth. Beauty, a founding value, can become the element of fusion between diverse disciplinary fields. The methods of quantitative history are the new point of reference in overcoming an excessively anthropocentric version of the geographical environment. The problems of industry are not separated from those of agriculture, and so the concept of agrisystem is developed, the study of which requires specific enterprise in the field of ecology, in the geography of settlements, and in the natural sciences. The analysis of context is key to understanding the relationships between ancient societies and the environment that hosted them, where microstories are the reactive containers where agricultural organizations, settlement structures, and architectural forms interact in a complex puzzle of hydro-geomorphological, climatic, and biologic components. The retaining wall of a terrace or a vineyard, respectful of the morphology of a slope, is not an invention, but the expansion of that which already exists. Let's recap these three chapters after reading them. So starting back with chapter 13, synesthesia and minerality. When we taste, our brains don't work in tidy, separate lanes. Sound, light, touch, smell, and taste all crosstalk. That's the idea behind synesthesia. It's a blending of senses that in wine often shows up as metaphors we all recognize. High acidity feels like a high musical pitch, whereas coarse tannin reads as sandpaper. A bright, CO2-kissed wine feels like a strobe light sparkle on the tongue. So where does minerality come from? Not from chewing granite. In practice, minerality is an impression. This impression is built by a pattern of cues that the brain bundles together and labels stone. Think of it as a stack. So we have a tension line, high acidity, and low pH. Pull the palate taut. Restrain fruit, so like citrus, green apple, rather than peach preserves, nothing overly sweet. Then we'll weave in a thread of phenolic bitterness. From skins, variety, press cycles, or aging vessels, adding grip at the edges. From there, we have a subtle reductive note, that struck match, calyx whisper, that many people call it, or flint. A little bit of CO2, that faint prickle that lifts everything and reads as brightness, and the occasional saline cues, not table salt, but savory, mouth-watering finish that suggests it's been kissed by the sea. When you put those together, your brain says stone. Not because molecules of limestone leapt into the glass, but because the pattern rhymes with how stone has been described to you. By teachers, by labels, and by place stories. The story doesn't really create acidity, but frames how you read it. So let's look at some quick examples with this. So think of Chablis. Classic Chablis often shows brisk acidity, delicate citrus, a trim line of reduction, what many people describe as like gunflint or steel. That structural stack is doing the heavy lifting. The Kimmeridgian chalk, that gives a story that it affixes to your brain and to a label. Or we look at Mosel Cabernet Riesling, very low alcohol. Searingly zesty acidity. Cool orchard fruit, sometimes a little whisper of fermentation CO2. Then we hear blue slate. And the pattern snaps into slate in your mind. The word it's an efficient shorthand, not a literal mineral transfer. Or let's take it back to Italy with Etna Bianco. We might describe Etna Bianco from Caricante as having a saline edge, a phenolic grip, a citrus pith. The volcanic mountain narrative primes this expectation. The structure confirms it. We end up saying volcanic or stony, but we're reporting a pattern, not actual pebbles. Here's a definition you can use on a floor sheet or in class. Minerality is the impression of stone produced by a specific combination of structure, especially acidity, aroma cues, often reduction, and context. It's a useful word if we keep it honest. So if you want to do a quick little exercise, there's a 45-second exercise you can try. If you're holding a glass of wine, maybe a high-acid white wine that you might think of being as having a sense of minerality to it. So take that glass, take a small sip, and the first thing you notice is the acidity. Now imagine as you're sipping and thinking about that acidity, imagine a pure high musical tone, like a single violin string, very bright. Keep that tone in your head and take another sip. Does the wine feel tighter, more linear, or a little more stony? Most people say yes to all three. Now imagine a low, warm cello note and sip once more, and you'll feel the edges start to soften. That's cross-modal priming in action. The wine didn't change, but your frame of reference changed, and in tasting, frames matter. As we go on to recap chapter 14, the magic of a story, the myth, let's talk about myth. Not the fairy tales, meaning frameworks. Wine myths do the real work. They carry values. They compress complex histories into teachable moments and bind people to places. The monks tamed the hillsides. The pioneer planted against it all odds. The terrace walls hold back the mountain. We've heard many variations of this in 1,000 different versions. Think of myth like a ladder. It helps guests climb from ignorance to interest, from interest to identity, Although used lazily, myth becomes gatekeeping, overpromising the past, erasing labor, or freezing a living space into a museum diorama. Here's an on-air myth audit that you can steal for trainings and copy. So we have the truth kernel. What's verifiably true? So, for example, flinty notes in some Chablis correlate with reductive choices in the cellar and brisk acid lines in the fruit. We have actors. Who made this real? Name the grower, the cellar teams, the coopers, the community. Myth should widen the circle. Include all production parts. Don't shrink it. And then timestamp. What has changed? Climate, press cycles, yeast management, canopy choices. Today's choices are not the choices of yesterday's past. And then evidence. What can a guest taste or see? Name concrete style markers and practices. And finally, there's no absolutes. Tell the truth and make space for exceptions. So to apply this quickly to gunflint and Chablis, the truth kernel, many top examples carry a struck match edge from reductive élevage layered over citric acidity. The actors include growers, dial in the press fractions, and sulfur management. Credit the hands, not just the hill. The timestamp. Viticulture and climate have shifted. Acid balance and ripeness management today are not those of 1985. The evidence, the lean palate, the tense acidity, and that precious matchstick nose. And no absolutes. Plenty of producers chase a purely fruit-driven, non-reductive style. Used like that, myths don't lie. It lifts. Our final chapter, chapter 15, Tradition and the Reconstruction of Memory. Tradition isn't a fossil. It's a curated memory. A community's ongoing edit of what's worth keeping. Regulations often encode that memory. Varieties we protect, yields we target, vessels we favor, flavors we prize. But memory is selective. What we foreground or quietly drop shapes what guests expect to taste. So there's two helpful distinctions here. We have inherited traditions, so practices that are passed along, and we have invented traditions. So these are new practices that feel old because they express deep values. Both can be authentic if they serve people in quality. Here's a simple memory map you can run with any winery or by the glass feature. So we start off with then. Name one historical practice that defined identity, say extended lees aging in large neutral wood to protect delicacy. Then we look at the now. So we name the modern analog that chases the same value, perhaps larger formats, ceramic, or careful inert gas management to keep texture without over oak. And then we have the because, where we name the enduring value, purity, longevity, a signature mouthfeel. When you present tradition as values over vessels, guests understand how places stay themselves while tools evolve. And your team avoids the trap of, or yourself avoids the trap of treating rules as relics. Climate is moving, markets are moving. Tradition can either adapt to carry a memory forward or calcify until it snaps. Here's a line that I like. Tradition is yesterday's solution that still evolves today. When it stops solving, we don't abandon the value, we change the method. All right, so with all of this, let's land the plane. Minerality isn't a rock in your mouth. It's a pattern your brain labels as stone. Myth isn't a lie, it's a ladder. It's a ladder that's used to lift, but not to gatekeep. And tradition is memory in motion. Hold the value steady while you adapt the method. If this episode sharpened your language or gave you a new teaching move, would you share it with a colleague? Or leave a quick rating. It helps more than you know. This is The Art of Wine Storytelling, as it was hosted by me, Ryan Robinson, while I read from Attilio Scienza's Art of Wine Storytelling. Excerpts, when used, are brief and fully attributed. Next time we connect, language to landscape, how words carve mental maps long before we ever see a vineyard. And until then, taste widely, question kindly, and tell better stories.
You've been listening to The Art of Wine Storytelling by Professor Attilio Scienza, read and commented by Ryan Robinson. The book is available now on our site, Mama Jumbo Shrimp, and Amazon. Follow the Italian Wine Podcast on all the major platforms so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to rate and review us.